Welcome to TEIMAS Talks. In the second episode, we're joined by Estrella Moreira, Product Director at TEIMAS, and an expert in waste management and Spanish waste shipment regulations. A highly knowledgeable voice to help us understand the logistical, environmental, and economic sides of the industry. Welcome, Estrella.
Thank you, Perla. A pleasure to be here.
From your experience, what are the most common problems waste managers encounter on this journey?
Waste managers face a number of challenges. One of the biggest issues is the lack of authorized treatment facilities, as already mentioned, for certain types of waste. Ideally, waste would follow a short local route, the kind that is more sustainable and cost-effective. But reality has proven that it often has to travel hundreds of kilometers just to find a facility that's properly licensed to accept it. And of course, the longer the journey, the higher the cost of treatment. Another common and quite serious challenge is the incorrect characterization of the waste by the producer. If what arrives at the facility doesn't match what has been declared, whether it is the composition, the EWC code, the hazard classification, or even just the quantity, the manager may be forced to reject it. That leads to delay, extra cost, and in some cases, potential legal consequences. It is a risk that no one wants to take, and it highlights how important it is to get those initial declarations right. And then, to make things even worse and complicated, a lot of this now happens through digital platforms. While moving online has definitely brought some advantages, the reality is that many of these systems sometimes they don't talk to each other. So even if you have uploaded all the necessary documents through a regional platform, that doesn't mean that it will automatically sync with the national registers. And as a result, companies often end up duplicating efforts, re-entering the same information into multiple systems just to meet compliance requirements.
Right, and from the point of view of a waste producer, what challenges do they face? What are the most common mistakes?
On the side of waste producing companies, there are plenty of challenges too, just a different nature. One of the most common issues is simply lack of technical knowledge around the legislation that applies and what their responsibilities actually are. Well, many of these companies aren't into the environmental sector. They might be, manufacturing, agri-food, construction, you name it. And for them, waste management can often feel like a side issue. It's like something subsidiary. But actually, the reality is quite different. These companies have very clear legal obligations as waste producers. You are responsible for correctly classifying and labeling their waste, for making sure it's handed over only to authorized operators, for example. Another stumbling block is documentation. Waste management involves a lot of admin, and things can easily go wrong if there isn't enough good coordination within the company. We often see cases where environmental officer isn't the one handling the paperwork, other person selects the waste manager who isn't the same person who actually later oversees the actual collection. And this lack of communication, as it's obvious, can lead to inconsistencies, incorrect data, misclassified waste, missing documents, and all of this can cause serious complications down the line and afterwards. And then there is something that's absolutely crucial, which is usually the cost of proper waste management is usually underestimated. Some companies, in an attempt to cut corners and to save a little bit of money, turn to unauthorized operators or so-called quick fixes that don't comply with legal standards. When I mean that they reach out to these quick fixes and to unauthorized operators, I'm not meaning that they look specifically for those kind of operators, but just that sometimes they don't they don't review all the documentation, and they may be using operators that are not allowed to deal with the waste they are producing, and that's really a risky move. Because at the end of the day, traceability isn't just about ticking legal boxes. It also is a safeguard for the company's reputation. And that matters now more than ever. Customers, investors, and society at large are increasingly demanding real, verifiable evidence that companies are managing their environmental impact responsibly. Waste is part of a company public image.
The world of waste is fascinating, really, and well, it's a pretty lucrative industry. Could you tell us a bit about waste pricing?
Yes, waste is increasingly being as an economic asset, even if we don't always think of it that way. In fact, some types of waste are actively bought and sold, much like raw materials. Of course, it all depends on the nature of the waste, its quality, and the wider market conditions at the time. Let's take paper and cardboard, for instance. There is actually an index that sets the price per ton, and that price can fluctuate quite a lot. There have been periods when the market value was so low that even though producers weren't paying to dispose of their paper waste, the waste managers were still losing money, simply because transport and treatment costs weren't being covered. But when the market strengthens, that same recycled paper suddenly becomes a valuable commodity again. It all shifts with demand. Metals, on the other hand, as copper, aluminium, steel, are a different story altogether. These are traded on global stock exchanges, so their prices are closely tied to international demand. And if a company produces a metal-rich waste and has been properly sorted, that material can have direct commercial value. In some cases, not only do companies avoid paying for its removal, that they might even be paid for it. Let's take, for example, another example. Plastics. Plastics are a good example of how quickly things can change. A few years ago, companies could earn around 100 to 200 or even more euros per ton of recyclable plastic. But today, many of them are having to pay to get rid of it. That's a big change. That's largely down to oil prices. I explain myself. If the oil prices are very high, the price of virgin plastic is higher, so they turn to recycling, and the other way around. If the oil prices are very cheap, it is cheaper also to produce virgin plastic, and the recycled plastic is not interesting for waste managers. It is all about timing, material quality, and what's happening in the market as global. As for metals, copper is one of the most volatile. It is traded on the international market, as you may know, and its price swings significantly based on global supply and demand. In recent years, for example, we have seen it range from 7,000 to 10,000 euros per metric ton, which is a wide span.
And going back to the bigger picture, which sectors generate the most waste?
In Europe, the largest share of waste generated comes from what's known as mineral waste, essentially materials from construction, demolition, and mining activities. This type of waste alone accounts for around 60% of all the waste produced across the EU, which gives you a sense of how dominant that sector is in terms of volume. Next on the list, although quite a bit lower, are the wastes generated by water and waste management services themselves. These make up about 10% of the total, and following closely behind is industrial waste, also contributing roughly about 10%. When I mention industrial waste, that includes also byproducts and discarded materials from manufacturing and processing industries. Everything from metal shaving and offcuts to chemical residues, so quite a variety. Then we have household waste, what we officially refer as municipal waste, that represents around 9% of the total waste generated in the EU. These are everyday items that we throw away at homes as packaging, paper, plastics, glass, everything.
Okay, that's also very interesting. And now I would like to ask you something that it's basic to understanding the system's impact and capacity. And it's what happens to all this waste once it's generated? Is it handled locally, or are we still exporting a lot?
Well, according to official figures from the European Environmental Agency, the vast majority of waste generated in Europe is actually managed locally. In line with what's known as the proximity principle, over the 90% of all waste is treated within the same country where it is produced, which is a great thing. That's a key part of the EU waste management strategy, keeping treatment close to the source whenever possible. Well, that said, there are still significant volumes being shipped abroad. Turkey, for example, by large, is the main destination for the EU waste exports, receiving around 13 million tons. After Turkey comes India and the United Kingdom. But going back to Turkey, in particular, this country became the top recipient of European plastic waste after China closed its doors to most foreign waste imports back in 2018. Today, Turkey receives more than a third of all plastic waste exported from the EU, and this situation has raised serious concerns about the environmental and social impacts of exporting waste, especially to countries that may lack the infrastructure to manage it safely and sustainably. In response, the EU has introduced the new Waste Shipment Regulation in 2024. This regulation introduced tighter controls, mandatory digital procedures, and also requires audits of the receiving facilities abroad, all aimed at ensuring that the EU waste is only sent to destinations that can manage it properly and transparently.
Yes, it's clear that waste is both a key economic player and a matter of environmental responsibility. Thank you so much, Estrella, for sharing all your expertise and helping us better understand the journey waste takes.
Thank you, Perla. It's been a pleasure.
And that's all for today. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this interview. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn for more conversations about waste and sustainability. See you next time.